The wind carried the dry scent of the high plains that day dust, brittle grass, and the faint tang of far-off rain that would never quite reach this land. Tahu rode alone, his painted Mustang stepping lightly across the cracked earth, the leather reins swaying loose in his hand. He was a man who had long learned to read the language of the open country, the bent stem of grass that told of a passing deer, the faint depression in the dirt left by a horse's hoof, the circling buzzards marking something dead ahead. But that morning, it wasn't buzzards that caught his attention. It was something else. A shape against the weathered wooden fence line in the distance. At first, he thought it was just a heap of old cloth snagged on a post, torn loose from some cattle drover's wagon tarp and left to tangle in the wind. But as he drew nearer, his eyes narrowed. The shape was moving slightly, weakly, almost, like the last breath of a wounded thing. He nudged his Mustang forward, the steady clop of hooves muted against the dry ground. The prairie stretched wide in all directions, empty and exposed, yet his senses prickled with caution. Out here, things weren't always what they seemed. Sometimes bait was laid out for the unwary and abandoned saddle, a crying woman, while rifles waited in the grass. Still, something in him refused to turn away. When he was close enough, he saw her. A girl, no, barely a woman, bound to the fence post with thick, sun-cracked rope that dug into her wrists so deep the skin was raw and bloody. Her arms were pulled back awkwardly, the coarse wood pressing into her spine. She had no shoes, only the dust-coated remains of stockings clinging to her ankles. Her dress was torn along the shoulder seam, the faded fabric hanging loose, and her hair long and tangled whipped across her face in the restless wind. She lifted her head when his shadow fell over her. Her eyes were pale, not blue like the northern settlers, not brown like the people of the plains, but somewhere in between, dulled with exhaustion yet sharp with an animal kind of fear. Her lips were cracked, her breathing shallow. She didn't speak, didn't cry for help, didn't even try to shrink. Away from him, only watched, as if waiting to see whether he would strike or save. Tahu swung down from his Mustang in one fluid motion, his moccasins landing silent on the ground. He didn't move too quickly. Spooked creatures, whether deer, horse, or human, tended to bolt, even when they couldn't run. The rope was knotted carelessly, as though whoever tied her there hadn't cared whether it held long. The sun had baked it stiff, the fibers rough against his hands as he began to work them loose. She flinched when his fingers brushed her wrist. "I will not hurt you," he said quietly, his voice carrying the deep calm of a man who had spent years speaking to wild things. She didn't answer. It took him a minute to free her. When the last rope slipped away, she slumped forward, catching herself against the fence before her knees gave out. Her arms bore the angry red marks of restraint. Her fingertips were swollen. He crouched in front of her, scanning for other injuries. "Can you stand?" She blinked at him, then gave a small, uncertain nod. She tried to rise, her legs trembling. He steadied her with a hand at her elbow. The land around them was silent except for the restless whisper of the grass. Whoever had left her here was long gone. But the way she kept glancing to the north told him she wasn't certain of that. Tahu studied her for a long moment. She had the look of someone who had been thrown away, discarded without thought or care. But there was something else to something that hadn't yet been broken. He pointed toward his horse. "Come, you cannot stay here." Her gaze shifted to the Mustang, then back to him. She hesitated, as though trying to weigh the danger of going with a stranger against the danger of staying where she was. In the end, it wasn't much of a choice. He helped her into the saddle, steadying her slight weight. She sat stiffly, her hands clutching the horn as though afraid the horse might throw her. Tahu mounted behind, taking the reins. The wind carried the dry smell of rope and the faint metallic tang of blood from her wrists. As they turned toward The low hills where his camp lay hidden, he could feel her breathing still fast, still uncertain but no longer as hollow as before, somewhere deep inside. He knew this was not the kind of meeting a man could simply walk away from. The ride back to Tahu's camp was a slow one. The girl sat ahead of him on the Mustang, her back rigid, her hands locked tight around the saddle horn. Every jolt of the horse made her flinch, as though she half expected someone to come charging out of the empty horizon to drag her back. Tahu didn't speak. He knew words could be as heavy as silence, and sometimes silence was easier to carry. Instead, he kept his eyes moving, scanning the ridges, the dips in the earth, the far-off dust trails. Out here, you could tell a lot by the way the land breathed. Today, the air felt uneasy. They crossed a shallow stream where the Mustang dipped its head to drink. He cupped water in his hand and held it toward her. She hesitated, her eyes darting from the water to his face, but the thirst in her won over whatever fear she still carried. She drank, the cold water spilling down her chin, and when she was done, she muttered something too soft for him to catch. By the time they reached his camp, the sun was starting to sink, bleeding gold and crimson across the sky. His camp was small, just a low-hide tent near the curve of a riverbank, a stone fire pit, and the makeshift corral where his Mustang sometimes grazed. It wasn't much, but it was safe, and safety was something a man didn't take for granted. He helped her down from the saddle. Her legs were stiff from the ride, and she nearly stumbled before finding her balance. The first thing she did was glance around, taking in every detail of the camp as if memorizing it, either so she could trust it or so she could find a way to leave. Tahu went to the fire pit and stirred the embers from the night before. He added dry wood, coaxing the flames to life, then took a rabbit from where it hung near the tent. He skinned and cleaned it with the ease of long practice, the smell of fresh meat soon mingling with the sharp scent of burning pine. She sat on a flat rock, watching him. Her eyes followed each movement of his hands, steady, unhurried, certain. He wondered if she'd ever seen someone cook over a fire before. When the meat was done, he handed her the first portion. She stared at it for a moment before taking a cautious bite. Then another, and another. Hunger had a way of breaking down walls, and by the time she finished, her shoulders had lost some of their rigid tension. Tahu poured her water from a skin, then took a drink himself. The girl cradled the water in both hands as though it was the most precious thing she'd ever held. The wind picked up as evening settled in, rattling the hide walls of the tent. She flinched at the sound, her eyes darting toward the darkness beyond the firelight. Tahu noticed. "You are safe here," he said simply. She didn't answer, but she pulled the blanket he handed her tighter around her shoulders. Her gaze still lingered on the shadows as though expecting them to come alive. Tahu didn't press her for answers. Some things needed time before they could be spoken aloud. Instead, he kept the fire burning high, knowing the light and heat would keep both predators and bad dreams at bay. When it was time to rest, he spread a blanket for her inside the tent and gave her the warmer of the two hides he owned. He chose to sleep outside, leaning against a log near the fire, his bow within arm's reach. As he sat there, watching the flames dance, he thought about the girl tied to that fence, about the way she'd looked at him with no name to call her own. He didn't know who she was or why she'd been left like that. But he knew one thing: she was here now, and as long as she was under his watch, no one would bind her again. Somewhere inside the tent, he heard her breathing steady into the rhythm of sleep. And for the first time that day, Tahu let his own eyes close, trusting the fire to keep them both through the night. The days that followed moved slowly, like the lazy current of the river near Tahu's camp. Morning came with the thin light creeping over the plains, spilling across the hide walls of the tent and painting everything in pale gold. The girl, still without a name, would rise quietly, never waking Tahu. As though afraid she might be scolded for moving before being told, she didn't speak much. When she did, her voice was barely above a whisper, and even then her words came in fragments, like scattered feathers lost in the wind. Sometimes it was a single word: water, fire, cold. Other times it was nothing more than a sound half-formed, as though she'd forgotten how to shape her thoughts into speech. Tahu didn't push. In the Comanche way, patience was a kind of strength, and forcing answers only made them retreat. Further, instead, he showed her how to gather firewood from the scrub trees near the river, how to use the flat stones to strike sparks when the flint was out of reach. She watched carefully, mimicking his movements with the quiet concentration of someone who had learned to survive by paying attention. But despite the small progress, there was a heaviness in her, an emptiness that went beyond hunger or exhaustion. It was the absence of belonging. A person without a name, Tahu knew, was like a horse without a herd, rootless, unclaimed, untethered to anything. One afternoon, they sat by the river. Tahu was mending the leather of his quiver, the rhythmic pull of the sinew needle steady and slow. The girl sat a little way off, braiding thin strands of dry grass into a loop. The way her hands worked, deliberate but aimless, told him she was trying to keep her mind busy. "You have no name," he said quietly, not as a question, but as a fact. She stilled. Her fingers froze on the braid, and she stared down at it as though it could answer for her. He set the quiver aside and looked at her. A name is a place to stand. Without it, the wind can take you anywhere. Her eyes lifted, meeting his for the briefest heartbeat. There was something in that look, uncertainty, yes, but also a faint flicker of wanting. Tahu thought for a moment. Names were not given lightly in his people's way. They carried meaning, spirit, a weight that followed a person for life. Weya. He said at last, speaking the word with care. She blinked, repeating it under her breath, her tongue testing the sound. Weya. It means wolf, he explained. A wolf can be hunted, but never tamed. It lives with the pack or alone, but it survives. She looked down at the grass braid in her hands. Slowly, she finished the loop and tied it off with the knot. Then she slipped it around her wrist as though sealing something inside herself. Weya, she said again, and this time it was stronger still, soft, but anchored in a way it hadn't been before. From that moment, he could see the smallest shift in her. It wasn't a sudden change. There were still shadows in her eyes, still moments where fear caught her breath. But now, when he looked at her, he didn't see just the nameless girl tied to a fence. He saw Weya, the wolf. That evening, as the fire crackled low and the moon rose over the plains, she sat a little closer to him than before. Not so near that it could be called trust, but close enough that the space between them no longer felt like a wall. Tahu said nothing. He didn't need to. She had a name now, and that was the first step toward having a place in the world. The weeks passed with the steady rhythm of life on the open plains. Mornings began with the pale light spilling across the riverbank, where Tahu would rise first to stoke the fire, his quiet movements barely stirring the air. Weya, still wrapped in her blanket, would watch him from the tent's opening before slipping out to fetch water or gather wood without being asked. The days had a shape, now small tasks that gave them both a sense of purpose. Weya learned to cook the fish Tahu caught from the river, to grind corn between two flat stones until her arms ached, to mend the small tears in his shirt with stitches so fine they were almost invisible. Sometimes when she thought he wasn't looking, she would hum to herself low, tuneless, but alive in a way she hadn't been when he first found her. But Tahu noticed other things too, more than once. While tending the horses, he'd catch sight of faint dust clouds on the far horizon too, distant to make out clearly, but moving against the wind. The sound of voices sometimes carried on the air, stretched thin by distance. At night, when the fire was low, he thought he heard the faint echo of hooves where there should have been silence. Weah noticed too, though she tried not to let it show. Whenever the Mustang lifted its head suddenly, ears pricked toward some far-off sound, her hands would tighten on whatever she was holding. Her eyes would flick to the north, always north, and linger there longer than necessary. One afternoon, while they were by the river cleaning freshly caught trout, she froze mid-motion. Tahu followed her gaze and saw 3 small specks moving along the ridge half a mile away. They were too far to tell if they were riders or just deer moving through the grass, but Weah's face had gone pale, her breathing sharp. "Who?" he asked, his voice low. She shook her head quickly, eyes dropping to the water. "No one," she murmured, but her hands trembled as she gutted the fish. You didn't press her yet. But that night he didn't sleep as deeply as he normally would. He sat by the fire long after Weah had gone to bed, the bow across his knees, listening to the shifting wind. Over the next days, the feeling grew stronger, an instinct sharpened by years of watching for danger. The riders in the distance came and went, never close enough to be sure, but always just near enough to remind him they were there. It wasn't the kind of watching you could mistake for chance. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Tahu decided to prepare. While Weah stirred the pot of rabbit stew, he checked his bowstring, the smooth curve of the wood, the sharp edges of his arrows. He set his knife within easy reach and made sure the Mustang was tied close, ready to move at a moment's notice. Weah said nothing, but he caught her watching him, her lips pressed together like she was holding back words. That night, the wind came hard from the north, carrying with it the scent of smoke faint, but enough to make him glance toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, someone was burning wood that wasn't theirs. Tahu lay awake until the fire burned down to embers, his hand resting lightly on the bough. He didn't know who was out there or what they wanted, but he knew this much: whatever had bound Weah to that fence wasn't gone. It was still moving in the dark, and sooner or later it would find its way to them. The night they came was colder than it had any right to be for that time of year. The moon hung low and silver, casting long shadows across the plains. The fire at Tahu's camp burned low, little more than a circle of red embers breathing faint light into the dark. Weah was asleep inside the tent, curled under the heavy hide blanket, her breathing steady. Tahu sat by the fire, sharpening his knife on a whetstone. He'd felt it building all day, that pressure in the air, that stillness in the grass when even the crickets seemed to pause. He'd seen dust again on the northern ridge that afternoon, closer than before. He didn't need to guess anymore. Whoever had been following them had decided to stop watching and start moving. The first sound came from the river hooves splashing through shallow water. Then came the voices, low but carrying in the night. 3 riders emerged from the darkness, like shadows solidifying, 2 broad men in trail-worn coats, rifles slung over their shoulders, and the third with a long scar down his cheek that caught the moonlight. Their horses snorted, restless. Scarface was the first to speak. "Evenin', Injun," he drawled, his tone dripping with mock politeness. "We've come for the girl." Tahu didn't move. "She is not yours." "She's not yours either," the man replied, smiling thinly. "Belongs to a man up north. Ran off with something that ain't hers. We're just here to take her back." The flap of the tent rustled. Weah's pale face appeared in the opening, her eyes wide. The moment she saw them, she froze like a deer in a hunter's sights. Her breath came in sharp, shallow bursts. Scarface tilted his head toward her. "See? Knows who we are." Tahu rose slowly to his feet, the firelight glinting off the edge of his knife. "Leave." The man's smile vanished. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, Comanche. Step aside." Tahu's answer was the soft twang of his bowstring. An arrow thudded into the dirt inches from the lead rider's boot. Quivering in the ground, one of the other men swore, jerking his horse back. Scarface's hand twitched toward his rifle, but he was too slow. Tahu moved with the speed of a striking snake, knocking another arrow and letting it fly before the man could level his weapon. The arrow struck his coat sleeve, ripping it open and knocking the rifle from his grasp. The fight exploded in an instant. The second man charged, swinging down from his horse with a knife, but Tahu met him head-on. They slammed together in the dirt, the air filling with grunts and the metallic tang of blood as Tahu's blade flashed in the moonlight. The man stumbled back, clutching his side. Scarface had recovered his rifle and raised it, but Weya's voice cut through the chaos. "Tahu!" He turned just in time to see her hurl a burning branch from the fire at Scarface's horse. The animal reared, screaming, and the man tumbled from the saddle into the dust. Tahu was on him before he could rise. The tip of his knife pressed against the hollow of Scarface's throat, his voice low and certain. "You will not come back." The man's breath hitched. He glanced at his wounded companions, then spat into the dirt. "She ain't worth it." They mounted up slowly, painfully, and rode off into the dark, their curses fading with the sound of retreating hooves. When they were gone, Tahu lowered his knife. The fire crackled again, filling the silence left behind. Weya was still standing near the tent, her hands shaking, her chest rising and falling like she'd run a mile. Slowly, she crossed the distance between them. Her fingers found the edge of his sleeve, clutching it not in fear now, but in something that felt dangerously close to trust. Tahu looked down at her, then at the dark horizon where the riders had vanished. He knew they might return someday, but tonight she was still here, still free, and he intended to keep it that way. The next morning dawned quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after trouble has passed, but not so far that its shadow is forgotten. A pale mist clung to the river, curling low over the water's surface before dissolving into the soft light of day. Tahu rose early, as always, though his movements were slower, more measured. The fight from the night before still lingered in his muscles, a dull ache in his shoulders and ribs. He checked the camp, walking the perimeter with a watchful eye. No tracks near the edge but their own. The riders had truly gone for now. Weya emerged from the tent, wrapped in the blanket he'd given her months ago. She stood at the edge of the river, watching the current slide past. There was no fear in her face this morning, only a quiet stillness. When she noticed Tahu watching, she offered the faintest smile, a real one this time. Small and almost shy, but alive. They went about the day as they always did. Weya fetched water. Tahu mended the corral fence. She cooked the morning meala, simple flatbread with the last of the smoked rabbit, and handed him his portion without a word. But he noticed how she stayed close, her shadow almost overlapping his in the dirt, as if some unspoken tether had formed between them. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of life returned, yet something was different now. Weya's steps were lighter. Her voice, still soft, began to carry more words, asking about the names of the stars, the meaning of the old songs Tahu sometimes hummed while working. She learned to braid the Mustang's mane without spooking it, to grind herbs into poultices for small cuts and scrapes. One evening, they sat by the riverbank, the air heavy with the scent of wild sage. The sun was dipping low, setting the sky ablaze with streaks of orange and rose. Weya was quiet, turning a small stone over and over in her hand. Tahu broke the silence. "Your name, does it feel like yours yet?" She looked at him, eyes steady. "Yes." Then, after a pause, she said it aloud, as if testing it in the open air. "I'm Weya." He nodded, his face calm, but inside, something eased like a knot coming loose. She tossed the stone into the river and watched the ripples spread. When you found me, I didn't know where I belonged. Maybe I still don't, but here. I don't feel like I'm just waiting to be taken away anymore." Tahu didn't answer immediately. He knew words mattered more when they weren't wasted. Finally, he said, "This place is yours as long as you want it." The wind shifted then, carrying the sound of the river and the far-off cry of a hawk. Weya leaned back on her hands, tilting her face toward the last warmth of the sun. The shadows lengthened, and the fire crackled to life between them as night settled in. Tahu knew there would always be dangers men who believed they could claim. What wasn't theirs? Storms that could sweep across the plains without warning. Winters that tested the strength of even the fiercest spirit. But as he watched Weya, the girl who had once been bound and nameless, now sitting unafraid beneath the open sky, he felt a certainty as strong as the earth beneath his feet. She had a name. She had a place. And as long as he drew breath, no one would take either from Avamna. Her again. This closes the arc with an emotional and grounded sense of belonging while leaving the door open for future challenges.